Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining. My name is Elizabeth Rainieris, and I'm the founding director of the Notre Dame IBM Technology Ethics Lab. And we are so happy to host our inaugural spring event today on moving from principles to practice in technology ethics. The mission of the lab is to promote human values in technology with the ultimate aim of helping steer technological design, development, deployment, and use in the direction of more equity and justice. We do this by producing and supporting tangible, applied, and interdisciplinary research projects to address core ethical questions, convening and facilitating dialogues and debates around technology ethics, and working to develop and inform permanent standards, laws, and policies related to the moral and ethical use of technology. Turning to today's event, the rapid spread of artificial intelligence and related technologies in recent years has been accompanied by a proliferation of principles-based ethical frameworks intended to guide their design, development, and deployment in practice. According to the UN Secretary General's Roadmap on Digital Cooperation, there are more than 160 distinct organizational, national, and international sets of AI ethics and governance principles worldwide, and countless others related to technology ethics more generally. But despite the existence of hundreds of sets of principles, we have limited evidence of their impact in practice. In today's panel, we will explore efforts to translate principled frameworks into principled action through a cross-sectoral interdisciplinary dialogue in line with the lab's mission. I'll begin by briefly introducing each of our distinguished guests today. Their full bios can be found on the event website, and going through them would keep us here all day. After that, I'll lead us in a discussion for about 30 to 40 minutes, leaving enough time for pre-submitted questions to the audience. And for those who registered and submitted questions, we do thank you. So first up, we have Jessica Field. Jess is a lecturer on law and the assistant director of the Cyber Law Clinic at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. Her work focuses on legal issues impacting digital media and art, including intellectual property, freedom of expression, privacy, and related human rights issues, as well as contract and corporate law. Recently, she has focused on AI-generated art, the overlap of existing rights and ethics frameworks and emerging technologies, and legal issues confronted by digital archives. She's a board member of the Global Network Initiative, GNI, a multi-stakeholder organization that protects and advances user freedom of expression and privacy around the world. Jess, thank you for being here. Next up, we have John C. Havens. John is the executive director of the Council on Extended Intelligence and the IEEE Global Initiative on Ethics of Autonomous and Intelligent Systems. He's also the founding and current vice chair of the IEEE 7010 Wellbeing Metric for Autonomous and Intelligent Systems Working Group, founding chair of the IEEE P7000 Draft Model Process for Addressing Ethical Concerns during System Design Working Group, and founding co-chair of both the Personal Data and Individual Access Control Committee, as well as the Wellbeing Committee of the IEEE's Global Initiative. John is also the author of Artificial Intelligence, Embracing Our Humanity to Maximize Machines and Hacking Happiness, Why Your Personal Data Counts and How Tracking It Can Change the World. And I believe he's also the only professional actor joining us today. John, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We are also joined by Philippe Andre Rodriguez. Philippe is the Deputy Director of the Center for International Digital Policy at Global Affairs Canada, the Canadian government's department in charge of diplomatic and consular relations, as well as a professor of the practice at McMaster University. He previously served as senior advisor at Canada's Privy Council Office on issues related to digital platforms and AI governance. Prior to joining the Canadian government, he was a fellow at Yale Law School and completed a PhD at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. His research has been published in the Cambridge Review of International Affairs, European Review of History, and Human Rights Review, among many others. Philippe, thank you for joining us. And next up, we have Francesca Rossi. Francesca is an IBM Fellow and the IBM AI Ethics Global Leader, and she leads AI research at IBM's TJ Watson Research Lab in New York. Francesca obtained her PhD in computer science from the University of Pisa and taught computer science both there, as well as at the University of Padova for nearly 20 years before joining IBM. She has published over 200 scientific articles, as well as a book in 2019. Francesca is a global leader in AI ethics, the founder of the IBM Internal AI Ethics Board, and a leading contributor to main global initiatives around this topic. She has been a member of the European Commission High-Level Expert Group on AI, part of the Global Partnership on AI Coalition, and she will also be the next president of the Worldwide Association of AI. Francesca, we're so glad to have you today. And last but certainly not least, we are joined by Fabro Stiebel. Fabro is a postdoc affiliated with the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University and a member of the Global Council of the World Economic Forum. For 6 years, he served as an independent researcher at the Open Government Partnership in Brazil and is also a fellow in open government with the Organization of American States, a postdoctoral fellow at the United Nations University, and a visiting researcher at the University of California, San Diego. Fabro is the executive director for the Institute for Technology and Society in Rio, a leading civil society organization in Latin America. So Jessica, John, Philippe, Francesca, and Fabro, thank you all so much for being with us today. Without further ado, let's dive right in. Jess, I'd like to start with you. You were a lead researcher and author of Berkman Klein's Principled AI project and report, which sought to map emerging areas of consensus across the many ethical and rights-based approaches to AI principles. Based on your research, could you please tell us more about the project and its findings, share your view on the state of AI ethics and its normative foundations, and perhaps also highlight any shortcomings of existing approaches or processes?
Absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth, and hello to my fellow panelists. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you all see that? Great. So happy to be here to talk about the Principled AI project. In some ways, it's a little bit of a snapshot in time, but it was certainly a response to the kind of feeling of overwhelm that came on us as we were watching quite a number of those 160 AI principles documents that Elizabeth referenced at the top of the program trickle in. As we were seeing that happen, and we were running the AI Ethics and Governance Initiative at Berkman Klein, we were really starting to think, apart from reading these documents sort of one by one as they come in, how could we arrive at some kind of yardstick to understand how these documents relate to each other? We can tell that they have some things in common. What are those things? Where are they diverging? And where we landed was the Principled AI project, which was published in January 2020. So it's a little more than a year old now. But I will go, here we go. So it is a white paper, and it is also accompanied by this data visualization, which I think is, to me, really helpful and actually was a core goal of the project, even as we were compiling the research. What we did was take a look at the breadth of principles documents, AI principles documents that were available at the time that we were doing the research in 2019, and try to curate a data set that was small enough to be manageable, but broad enough to represent kind of the conversation at the time. So this, in this visualization, the every spoke of the wheel is one set of AI principles, with the exception of the OECD and G20 AI principles, which apart from some prefatory material are functionally identical in their wording. So they actually appear on one spoke. Each color corresponds to a stakeholder group. So you have government in green, intergovernmental organizations in orange, multi-stakeholder groups in blue, private sector in pink, and civil society in yellow. And then each ring of the wheel corresponds to one of the themes that we arrived at. So just to get a sense of the body of data we were looking at the time we published this, I think there were more like 100 principles documents out there. This shows the documents that we chose to include on a timeline. Those colors are the same, so you can see that the earliest documents, there are a couple of multi-stakeholder documents from the Partnership on AI and Asilomar, as well as some government documents early on. But the bulk of the documents we were looking at were coming in over 2018 and 2019. We have Philippe Andre on this call, so I will note that in scoping this, we were looking directly at principle statements. So for example, at this time, Canada had adopted its world-leading regulation on the government acquisition of AI technology. We did not include that document, although we were aware of it and admirers of it, because it was adopted as a regulation, and we wanted to compare head-to-head, really, principles documents. So what are some of the themes that we arrived at? We have from the center out, and they're in no particular order here. Actually, they're arranged in the order that they are, mostly because of how much space the words took up on in the visualization itself. So privacy is the tiniest one and fit in that middle ring. So we have privacy, accountability, safety and security, transparency and explainability, fairness and non-discrimination, human control of technology, professional responsibility, promotion of human values. And then the outermost ring collects information on whether the document in question mentioned international human rights, either just in terms, like if actually in so many words, if it's just a diamond. If it's a star, it referenced actual instruments of international human rights law and referred to itself as sort of proceeding from an international human rights framework. The size of the dot at the intersection of each spoke and ring indicates how many principles that fit into that category the document covered. So there's a huge range in terms of the principles hang on, I have a slide here somewhere. Here we go. In terms of how many principles fall under each theme. So you can see, for example, there are quite a number of principles under accountability, ranging from accountability writ large to recommendations for new regulations, impact assessments, auditing requirements, verifiability and replicability, liability concerns, appeals processes, environmental responsibility, creation of a monitoring body, and remedies for automated decision-making. And you can contrast that with human control of technology or promotion of human values. The latter has just 3 principles within it. Whether the AI in question is leveraged to benefit society, whether it is used to promote human values and human flourishing, and whether there's a question of kind of access to technology in the AI principles statement. So I mention that because when we look at these rings, it's important to remember that you can compare within the ring. So you can see, for example, that here we go. This is the Dubai AI principles and ethics document. And this is the German AI strategy that in fairness and non-discrimination, the AI, sorry, in fairness and non-discrimination is here. The Dubai document covers more of those principles than the German document. Does that mean it is better? No. It just has a broader breadth of coverage. So I think the thing that we took away a number of things from this research at the end of 2019 and into the beginning of 2020. One was that there really was this sort of convergence of themes. And I was reassured when we published this research, there were a number of other sort of similar papers that came out in the months immediately before and the months following. And while we all grouped themes very slightly differently, I think that these kind of core themes, which hadn't been identified before, were largely apparent across those papers. And so I think we did start to see that there was a kind of conversation emerging in the AI governance field that may feel in 2021 obvious. It certainly wasn't at the time we were doing the research. The thing that I think is the bigger challenge, and the reason that I want us to put a little bit of an asterisk around that consensus, is that I mentioned at the top that we did purposive sampling here, right? So this was not an effort to include every principles document that we could find, but rather to sort of come up with a strong sample that would represent the breadth of the conversation. And you can see in this chart that breaks down by stakeholders that we were able to get a pretty good breadth of representation, from a lot of government principles, yes, but like decent number of civil society, private sector, multi-stakeholder principles as well. I'm going to skip, sorry, these slides are, there we go. This is what I want. We also strove really hard to find geographic diversity within the principles documents that we included, even though we had a vastly multilingual research team with speakers of something like 6 or 8 languages, and we're researching in those languages in addition to it, just in English, which I speak leading the team. You see that this is dominated by North America and Europe. So yes, we can say that this research revealed a kind of a core set of themes, but also it is a set of themes that are highly dictated by the governments and private companies and civil society organizations that tend to be best resourced and have the loudest voices in North America and Europe. And and to some extent, East Asia, especially China. There are vast regions of the world and regions of the world that are likely to be highly impacted by AI that are just really not represented here. So I think that that's an important caveat to kind of take with us as we start this discussion, which is not only how are we doing at implementing the principles that we have, but also what is the foundation of those principles, and is that the appropriate foundation to govern AI? And I'm going to wrap up there.
Thank you so much, Jess. That was a really wonderful overview. I think a really great place to start this conversation and take stock of where we are. I found the pie charts particularly helpful in illustrating the participation of different sectors as well as different geographies. Trying to bring in different sectors and geographies was really important to this conversation. I do want to appreciate the difficulty with the pandemic and that different parts of the world are really impacted in very profoundly uneven ways. So I do appreciate everyone being here. That said, it's also interesting to notice how the consensus you talked about has some of the shortcomings we've seen, for example, in human rights frameworks, which also have been criticized for not necessarily representing a global consensus, but overrepresenting certain parts of the world and underrepresenting others. So I'm sure we'll turn back to some of these themes. Right now, I'd actually love to pivot and turn to Francesca. So Francesca, given your own involvement in many of the organizations and multi-stakeholder groups that were actually mapped in that principled AI project, as well as your many roles at IBM, I was hoping you could tell us about how companies like IBM are translating some of these principles into practice, including how you leverage some of the foundations that Jess outlined for us, and any challenges that you faced in turning these principles into principled action, particularly within the structure and hierarchy of a large global corporation.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. So let me share my screen. Okay, so yes, so I think that the whole discussion around AI ethics and how to operationalize the principles, whether it's in a country or in a company, has to start with the vision of what one wants to do with this technology. And usually I call it the vision of, but actually more with AI, meaning that the goal here is not really to advance AI per se, but to advance people, societies, the way we live, our values with the technology. And so what would be the properties of this technology that can help us reach that vision? And I would say that, AI is still not general and adaptable enough. So AI has a lot of success in solving many different problems, but it still has limitations. And that's why there is a large research community that tries exactly to address those limitations, to make it more trustworthy, reliable, robust, explainable, aware of its bias, and so on, respecting privacy, human rights, and many of those cited already earlier on. To make it more able to work with us, so supportive and collaborative, to be able to work with human beings and to support our decision-making capabilities, which are also limited in some sense, and in other sense, maybe we are even better than machines, but we are complementary. And then also to make it sustainable and computationally scalable. So I think that we need to have a vision of what we want to do with AI to be able to understand what are the principles and then how we operationalize these principles. So when I present I give presentation around AI ethics, I always have a slide with the principles of AI project and the round visual that Jess presented earlier. So I didn't put it here, the slide, because I knew that Jess was going to go into details, but I really like the way it was conveyed, the way it was put together, but I also put it there to say that, yes, we have enough principles. We are done with the principles. Now we have to move forward from the principles. But when I think about the principles, I also like to think about, because I received this question and people say, why AI ethics? Why not technology ethics in general? Why? So what is so special about AI? So here I just laid down some of the issues that are also in what just presented, but I try to relate it to some features of AI, like the need of large amounts of data, the fact that is often these techniques currently are kind of a black box. So that's why explainability is an issue, and transparency. The fact that AI can make or recommend decisions. So we have to make sure that the values in making the decision are the same, like fairness as we like. The fact that it's based on statistics, is always a small percentage of error if you use machine learning. So that's why people think, oh, well, then who is accountable if there is that error? Because after all, that error doesn't come from an error from some developer, right? And then other ones. So, I mean, I think that there is still some discussion to do about principles in how to relate them to the characteristics of this technology particularly. But I think really we need to move on. So the principles for me are just the beginning of a long journey that a country or a company has to do in order to understand really how to change things, how things are done, how AI is designed, developed, delivered, used, and so on. So at IBM, we started with our principles, very simple, very high level, that are called Principles of Trust and Transparency, 2017. And we said, well, first, we think that AI should augment human intelligence, support human decision-making. Second one is about, principle is about the data that belongs to whoever provides the data. And the third one is a focus on transparency and explainability. And you see that here we talked about principle of trust and transparency, but we don't really say what trust means. So the next thing that we did after publishing this principle was to say what we mean by trust. So trust can mean many different things. At IBM, we said, let's focus on 4 things. Besides accuracy, of course, besides privacy, the 4 things that we want to focus on is fairness, explainability, robustness, and transparency. So we gave a structure to this notion of trust, which is not just trust in the technology, but trust in the whole ecosystem that produces and uses this technology. So then once we had these 2 things, it was still not enough, because of course these 2 slides are not enough to give to developers and say, okay, now change the way you produce AI. That's not what is useful to them. So that's why we put together a lot of other activities, guidelines, toolkits, a lot of educational material, culture change, design thinking sessions, a lot about governance, being able to supervise and coordinate all these activities, and then a lot of work with our clients, our partners, so our entire ecosystem, and also all the partnership that we have with academia, like this one with Notre Dame, but also with other companies, other institutions, organizations, and so on. And you see that here I put these pink arrows saying that this is not a static thing. This is evolving. This is a journey that the company has to go through in putting together all these pieces. So, for example, at IBM, as a governance, centralized governance, we have put together this AI ethics board that coordinates all the activities around AI ethics, and this is especially important, the coordination in a large company like IBM. A lot of activities to change the way people think about these issues, so education, awareness for developers, for managers, for the executives, as well as technical solutions like open source or proprietary toolkits to detect bias and mitigate it, to provide explainability, transparency, and so on. As well as a lot of help for our developers to change the way they produce AI and make sure that they include these AI ethics handling tools and methodologies integrated into their development pipeline. On the left, you also see these 4 areas, which are the 4 areas in which AI research at IBM is structured. And you see that one of the 4 areas is about trusted AI. So we So a lot of initiative pushed from research, because there are maybe innovative results, innovative algorithms that then are pushed into our open source and proprietary toolkits to be used. You also see this AI Fairness 360, AI Explainability 360, which has 2 open source toolkits that we put together for these 2 issues, as well as this pink booklet that we put together for our designers and developers. It's called Everyday Ethics for AI, that tells them through running examples how to be more aware of their own biases and what it means for a system to be explainable. A particular emphasis we put on the issue of transparency through this mechanism that is, we call it the AI fact sheet, which is basically one way of implementing this idea of transparency by documentation. Developers and designers need to respond to this long list of questions that allow them to document all the design choices that they make during the development and design pipeline. But it's important that it's not just a checklist to be filled at the end of the development process, but it's something that should be considered throughout the whole pipeline, and is useful for themselves as well to add new processes if needed, but also for clients, especially those that work in a very regulated domain, but also for users, for regulators, for auditors that possibly want to know what happens when developing that AI system. Let me go directly here. So say a little bit more about the AI ethics board. As I said, a big role is awareness and coordination, but also supervised internal education and retraining of various roles within the company around AI ethics. It links the research division to the services and to the platform and product divisions, which otherwise it would be less seamlessly linked to each other. It also gives advice to the offering teams to make sure that what they offer, what they deliver to our clients is aligned to our principles. And we use a risk-based approach where we vet the technology itself, the uses of the technology, as well as the client and the context in which the technology will be used. We develop new methodologies for, as I said, for developers, designers. We have internal governance frameworks for each one of these activities. We work with our clients to define a sort of AI ethics interoperability to make sure that our clients understand what we accept, and they work with principles and with the operationalization of principles that are compatible with ours. And then we also define policies and inform or advise regulators. Here is a picture with all the partnership, many of the partnership that we are, but the main point here is that it's very multidisciplinary, very multi-stakeholder with academia, companies, government, civil society organization. And the idea here is that we bring our expertise into this partnership, but we also learn a lot from all the stakeholders that we work with inside these partnerships. And so we think that no single company, no matter how big it is or how old it is, like IBM, can do it by itself. You know, AI is by now definitely a multidisciplinary and multi-stakeholder effort. One thing that is very recent that I wanted to add here is the new proposal for the AI regulation that was published by the European Commission just a few days ago, last week. And here, this is very aligned with what we have in mind about regulating AI. And of course, the regulation around AI isn't one more way of going from principles to practice. You know, the European Commission had to list, for example, all the AI applications that are unacceptable or have a high risk or low risk or minimal risk, and then give obligations to many stakeholders for each one of these levels. And the point that is nice here that we really welcome and that we have also been advocating in the past is this idea of procedure regulation, which is basically the fact that first you regulate AI applications and not the technology per se. And second, that you have a risk-based approach. In this particular case, the European Commission chose 4 levels of risks, and then the emphasis on building trust. You know, that is also so central for us, but also we see it also in this proposal. This proposal has been based on many consultations, of course, but I'm very happy to see that the work that we did with the high-level expert group is really present in this proposal for regulation in many different ways, the issues, the risk-based approach, and many others. So the transparency, emphasis, the human oversight, and so on. And the last bullet point here is that also, this regulation proposal acknowledges the fact that even regulating AI is a place where many stakeholders have to play their part, providers, users, and many other stakeholders. So in the proposal, there are obligations not just on those who provide AI, but also on the users and also on others. And that's something, a very important point to be understood. So here I just put some useful links for people, and I'm happy to share the slides. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca. A very, very clear articulation of what it means to turn these principles into practice. And a really excellent point as well on regulation as a form of operationalizing the principles. Another really tangible operationalization of these principles has come through standards and standards organization. So with that, I would love to turn to John. John, you wear so many hats at the IEEE, it can be hard to keep track sometimes. But fundamentally, I'd like to look at how standards bodies like yours are leveraging some of these principled foundations that we've mapped and outlined, and particular challenges in turning these normative frameworks into things like technical standards, but also non-technical standards, which may be harder to measure or may pose more qualitative challenges and standards. So things like your work around the well-being standards come to mind. But if you could just situate the standards community in this multi-sectoral, interdisciplinary, geographically diverse conversation around technology ethics, that's probably the best starting point there.
Sure, and I know I have 7 minutes to speak, but you reading my title took 4 of them, so sorry about that. Actually, I'm going to share my screen, and I love the title that you chose for today. Let's see if I can get to it easily. How do I get to?
Yes, it was in part inspired by the IEEE's Ethics in Action.
Yeah, well, and I'm just, if I can get to, why is it not letting me share my screen? Okay. Maybe can you go to that link easily, Elizabeth, so people don't just watch me search here? All right, I'll give it a shot. Here we go. This is my entire time, is me looking to get to the right link. Anyway, I'll start talking. So first of all, it's an honor to be here, and congratulations on the launch. And also want to point out that I'm honored to be here with the different guests that you have on. And here we go. Thanks for making this. There we go. Okay, so Ethics in Action is a website that we created about 3 years ago, where I'm going to start with the foundational work that we did called Ethically Aligned Design. Now, here's the thing about Jessica's work that she knows we're friends, and we talked about this. The work that she did is foundational and so helpful, because comparing so many different documents, God bless you, I could not have done that, Jessica, that was so hard. What we did with this project is back in 2016, we did the first version of this paper, and we had people like Francesca Rossi, who is currently still on our executive committee, who helped drive the work. We had this amazing event, and I remember really getting to know Francesca at that event in The Hague back in 2016. Francesca was actually one of the first people we'd called, I think we said like issues or problems or something. And Francesca said, wait, why are these are issues to discuss? So this document was kind of designed to be a little bit different than other principles documents anyway. And also I was new to the space when we started, but I bring this up to say, we did a first version that came out in 2016. And we were honored to hear that that first version and second version were hopefully helpful to people. But just like Jessica pointed out, our first version, it was extremely, if not exclusively, North American and European. So one thing that we just got lucky, and IEEE is focused on this in terms of how we do a lot of our processes. In fact, all of them is designed to be consensus driven. And to your point, Elizabeth, about standards, where you create, this is what IEEE does, is sort of has tools, resources, staff, like me, is to bring people together. And like all of us on the call share this vision, is to cross-pollinate across different audiences, policymakers, academics, the business community, to say, how do we put these principles into practice? So that said, after we did the first draft of Ethically Aligned Design, a lot of the feedback we got, and I remember I read through it, 500 pages, was people saying, this is great stuff, but it's really Western. Now, I bring that up because a lot of what we're talking about today, and in terms of standards, and you mentioned technical with the idea of either socio-technical or normative. And Francesca just mentioned she's foundational in creating the EU AI guidelines as part of the high-level experts group. It's fascinating to think about language, by the way, right? In terms of what does technical mean, right? Or what does, and then what does, how are we defining things that may not be technical? Anyway, I bring this up because if you look at the chapters that are in ethically aligned design, I was a part of writing some of these, but there's about 700 people that wrote this document over the course of the 3 years and the 3 versions that came out. And I also am really excited. Francesca led one of the committees, et cetera. But there's a couple of chapters I want to point out that are relevant, Elizabeth, to your question. One is the classical ethics and AI chapter. And Jessica knows about this work because of other stuff we're working on together. This was a chapter that came directly from feedback, from people saying this feels really Western. I was like, I don't know what that means. So we invited people to be a part of the committee. And that chapter is written almost exclusively by non-Western experts, saying what are things like the Shinto tradition in Japan, Ubuntu ethics from South Africa, what are Confucian-oriented traditions. Why this is critical is that, like IEEE, which is a global, what's called an SDO, Standards Development Organization, a big part of understanding any aspect of this work is to ask the question, who isn't at the table yet? Indigenous populations, certainly diversity in terms of women, race, et cetera. So another thing I wanted to point out, and then I'll get more to the standards, is well-being, as you can mention, see that word here, and then also personal data and individual agency. In terms of the principles that are the first chapter of ethically aligned design, consensus-driven wise, our teams voted on what those principles should be in order of importance, which is really interesting, meaning that's what the decision was. Human rights, like Jessica was talking about, that common theme. One thing also, we had our second big meeting in Austin in 2017, and a lot of the lawyers were like, hello, ethics is great. What about international human rights law? And I was like, cool. So I bring that up to say, when you design these amazing technologies, the order of how you think about what you think about is beyond critical, right? If you are at the outset of design saying, this is our primary recommendation with ethically aligned design and with responsible AI or technological innovation, is to say, if I want to build this phone and I've already built, say, a $3 million prototype, and then I start asking things about like transparency and whatever, that's a very different set of constraints than saying at the outset, at the very beginning of design, 2 things. One is, how do we make sure we're thinking about aspects of all these areas of risk and the end users? But then the well-being, I just want to point out because it's critical. Well-being is not about, in our ethically aligned design, about mental health or physiological health alone. It's actually an economic term. Because when we talk about what we're talking about today, a critical question, to your point, Elizabeth, about well-being, is what are the metrics of success, or in the business parlance, key performance indicators of what we're building? And Francesca mentioned risk. It's fascinating to think about risk. And the EU has done some groundbreaking work in their report that just came out last week. Similarly, the FTC in the United States, I would say, has done the same, which is risk being defined as physical risk. Will this autonomous vehicle crash based on the LiDAR sensors? Incredibly important to ask. But also asking, as the EU has done recently, what about how algorithms might score someone differently if they're from a marginalized population in such a way that then their judicial sentences would be different than someone else, right? All I'm saying here is how we define risk in this present state, regulation-wise and with technology, et cetera, and how these are put into standards and law is evolving in ways where we can't necessarily say, this is technical, this is socio-technical, which is why this work led to a creation of standards, a standard series called the P as in Peter 7000 series, and that just stands for project, which was really about saying, how can we mirror the work that was done with about 3,000 people who helped, 700 people who helped write this paper and about 3,000 people in a larger community. And like we're all doing here, because we're all part of the same community, is to say, how do we take these amazing technologies and recognize, first of all, the data agency is critical, right? We talk about AI, it's a big space, it's machine learning, it's all these different areas of study. So much of it, if not all of it, comes back to how is data accessed And in terms of our human data, if we don't have access to the data and portability of that data, things like being able to use blockchain or going to countries like Finland or Estonia, who are really giving their citizens the opportunity to access their data and really have parity about how that data is shared. That's what we talk about in ethically aligned design, built on top of GDPR, things like governments and businesses being required to follow certain guidelines about privacy, great. But that's kind of like the outside in, the inside out is also data agency for human rights and integrity and agency. The well-being I already mentioned, but there the basic logic is sort of a triple bottom line, people, planet, and prosperity. We must be asking ourselves in this community, is what we're building, these amazing technologies, the primary constraint or measure of success, largely around one set of existing, coming from GDP or shareholders, sort of exponential growth values. Even saying things like AI for good, building a technology that might eradicate cancer, fantastic. But is that all happening on the structure of the economics that exist now, the status quo? That means it's not that it's evil or unethical. It's critical to come from a more empirical lens and say it is economic. And if the constraints that businesses are put under are exponential growth, then even when we are trying to protect the environment or human well-being, that comes after that first set of constraints are satisfied. And that means that, by definition, we are deprioritizing planet and people. So countries like New Zealand, Scotland, Iceland are prioritizing this triple bottom line. And by the way, it's also interesting, I'll wrap up my 7 minutes, that the EU is so progressive in terms of things like having health insurance for their citizens. Comparing the EU and the States is often quite interesting. And then comparing all of global North to global South is interesting as well. Here, I'll just say, I'll put my information in the chat. All of our standards groups are open, free to join. We'd love to have you join. And the standards are really the instantiation of this work from ethically aligned design, which is really putting principles into practice. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John. And we will be sure to also share those resources with folks who've either tuned in or registered. So having looked at the perspective of the private sector and technical standards bodies, I do want to turn to government and civil society. Let's turn to Philippe next. So with your background both in academia and now government, how have you seen governmental and public sector stakeholders like Global Affairs Canada translate some of these principles into practice? We heard Jess mention how Canada was in some ways ahead of the curve, going straight to regulation before others were even working on principles. So in that sequence, how did the principles in turn inform some of the practice? And also, please feel free to highlight any specific challenges you faced in operationalizing these frameworks, specifically in turning them into actionable guidance for public sector interested stakeholders.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And, this is a great panel and very, very timely. Actually, this week, I am leading the Canadian delegation to the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which is really the first entirely global process on the ethics of AI from a multilateral perspective. So really timely panel indeed. So I don't want to take too much time. I see we are relatively short, but I want to make a few points. First, I want to go back to 2017. So I know we heard from John in terms of, a lot of work was actually done in the private sector in the standards world prior to. But for us, the story really starts in 2017 in Canada when at the global level, and I really want first to focus on some of these global conversations, and then I can speak to some of what we're doing in Canada. But we introduced the idea of we need some kind of conversation on AI between countries in a more sustained manner, given that we're starting to see some of the harms that are associated with the use of artificial intelligence. And that's been really one of the drivers really to bring together different countries around this question. And at the time, actually, we brought this in the context of the G7 presidency. And really, we were quite surprised, but actually most countries were not really thinking about artificial intelligence as a policy field outside of really something that is essentially an industrial policy. So they were not thinking necessarily about the harms and the ethics of the technology. And so when we brought this to the G7 during the Kenyan presidency in 2018, there was a lot of pushback. There was a lot of pushback from industry. There was a lot of pushback from some countries within the G7 to actually discuss this issue as an ethical issue. Actually, it ended up leading to what is the Canada-France statement on artificial intelligence, which is really the basis for what is now known as the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, of which IBM is a very active member, and Francesca, obviously, which is really one of the organizations thinking more practically around how do we turn these principles that we're seeing all over the place. And obviously, totally agree, Jessica's piece is absolutely foundational. And we tried to have mappings, and I think everybody kind of was doing the mappings, but then when that piece came out, we kind of just said, look, we have the authoritative piece. We don't need to do any of this work. So that was great. And so, yeah, Global Partnership on AI was really one of these initiatives, and really an initiative that seeks to be inclusive, bringing countries such as Brazil, India into the mix, a lot of Global South outreach, increasingly to really have something that is more inclusive than, as we've kind of noted before, a group of European and North American countries dictating what the rules of the road should look like. However, and as I think going back again to Jessica's mapping, a lot of this work has been done in the pace of 2-3 years. And that pace has been way too quick for a lot of countries. And so when we see a lot of these conversations, and even this week at UNESCO, we realize that there's still a huge gap in terms of understanding of this ethics piece between countries that have had this sustained conversation for a while, such as Canada, and a host of European countries, versus some countries that might not have the capacity, the literacy to engage in those normative conversations at the global level and have a really solid, understanding of the issues. And so that's been a bit of a challenge to really be inclusive, understand that a lot of work is ongoing, a really rapid pace, multiplication of processes, but also being inclusive in a sense of being able to bring along some of these groups that may not have the capacity to meaningfully engage from a literacy perspective, from a capacity perspective, for instance. So navigating that has been quite difficult, trying to remain inclusive, but also keep up and continue to advance this file. So that's really at the global level. And we can go back. We've talked about some of the challenges with the human rights language and why it's useful, where it's not useful, and we can come back to that. But just at the domestic level, we've already mentioned Canada has a directive. It's not a regulation, but that's really technical on the use of AI in government. And really, we strive to basically implement all of the principles that we've heard from previous speakers. So transparency, open by design, human rights framed, and really it's one that is constantly evolving. So every 6 months it is being updated, because we know the technology is evolving and new challenges, new harms are brought to the fore that we need to take into consideration. It is also risk-based, because obviously the risk is not the same if you're talking about using an AI system to grant a visa versus using an AI system to detect fish patterns in the ocean, for instance, right? So the risk is not necessarily the same, and we need different types of mechanisms to be able to address these different situations. AI we like to call it AI, but really it's in the application that we need to think about the ethics much more than in the technology itself, as Francesca in particular said earlier. We've also really focused on literacy, because we feel like in order to make the right decisions, we need an informed citizenry that can participate in those conversations. And this takes time. And this is partly why, in terms of regulation, I think Canada has been a bit slower to have a general, data protection regulation, because there was this feeling that we still need to do a lot of this literacy piece, so that decisions that are made are actually democratic and then can be made accountable, and that there can be an accountability mechanism in the public to actually ensure that we are going in the right direction ethically and in terms of being entirely democratic. And then finally, so going back to human rights, I think this is really a priority for us. Why? Because it's already this baseline that we have, right? Like there are definitely issues with human rights, and it's definitely not enough. There are gaps within the human rights framework in terms of AI ethics. I think we all recognize that. For instance, environmental implications are completely excluded essentially from this. Some of the intersectional elements related to harms are difficult to actually grasp in the context of human rights. Obviously, responsibility of industry is sometimes difficult, and especially in terms of enforcement mechanisms, despite the fact that we have, for instance, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. We still have a lot of gaps and we still have a ways to go. But I think by and large, there is this increasing recognition, even at UNESCO, I must say, even in the Global South, there is this recognition that's starting from human rights and then building on top of that a more robust ethical framework is the way to go, to start from somewhere where, we all have this baseline, we all, have international legal obligations as countries that we can build from and then build something bigger. So I'll leave it at that and definitely welcome the conversation on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philippe. I really appreciate your perspectives on this. As we are running short on time and we saw how starkly underrepresented Latin America has been in this conversation, I want to take moderator's prerogative here to give Fabro the rest of the time, or as much as you need, to give us your perspective on what are we missing in this conversation and how is the perspective different from where you are in Brazil?
Thank you very much. Congrats for the lunch. And how to follow the previous talks, because they're very good. So I'll bring 3 topics here. I don't think they have appeared yet, although they are transversal to the others. And this is a perspective from Brazil. So in 2018, we did an event in Rio de Janeiro for 3 days, 40 countries, 400 people on AI ethics and inclusion. The idea was to define, to identify an agenda for research and investments, multi-stakeholder way. The most important finding for me is the survey we did before we start the event. So we sent out a form saying, one of the questions was, what do you consider to be most important in AI and ethics inclusion agenda? And then if you break down the results from the Global North and the Global South, the results are very different. From the Global North, it's about principles, it's about implementation, it's about the ethics itself. From the Global South was about inclusion, was about education. And this is very important, as we know, 2-4 years later, how the difference it makes when you have less people talking, when you have less funds. And then I come to the second point, which is polarization. When we did in Brazil, the Marco Civil Internet, the Brazilian Internet Bill of Rights, this is a multi-stakeholder debate that we host in the internet, through the internet, with everyone. Okay, not whole Brazil, not a whole country, but even so, it's a different way to do policy. And the results are quite good. The Marco Civil is 7 years old. We have over there net neutrality, safe harbors, a very interesting debate for digital rights. Could we do that today? Really hard to answer, because polarization nowadays is just so strong, so hard. And how does connect to access? Funds for civil society, funds for academia has gone down, and funds for government and private sector has been stable because they have other sources for funding. And this increases the gap of how we can have a multi-stakeholder debate around AI and ethics. I'm not complaining, I'm just saying it's a different spectrum. So we learned the lesson on multi-stakeholder way, we love it, but it's harder now to do a multi-stakeholder debate. And with the whole polarization, you spend every 2 arguments, one fighting against, no, 5G is not about cancer. So you spend a lot of resources on fighting polarizations. And that leads for me to the last debate on the Global South perspective, which is the balancing between use and abuse. There's a lot of discussion on the abuse of AI ethics, and they're very important. Face recognition for certainly something that we can easily talk about, right? You have bias on gender, you have bias on race, you have main use for security, inequality society, and so on. At the same time, we do have the agenda of use. The use of face recognition for digital identity can be inclusive in a country where 30% doesn't have internet and 40% doesn't have a bank account. The use of face recognition for elderly people to access lawyers and some public services, it's very inclusive. So how do you find a way to debate use and abuse without just focus on abuse and also using the use. And this is really hard. So last week, for example, one of the main favelas Islam society organizations, they wanted to be very transparent on how food is distributed to citizens. And they decided to, why not use face recognition? So I'm giving you rice, you are receiving rice. And then with face recognition, we have transparency in the system. And then all the questions comes, wait, where is the data going to? Well, have you considered the vulnerable groups? What? So there is an important agenda use, there's an important agenda on abuse, and how do you combine this? In the case of the implementation in Islams, this is a bad, they haven't seen the issues and they stop it for 24 hours later. But when you think about government implementing technology and so on, sometimes you stop ideas before they even start and they can promote inclusion. So how do we discuss ethics, but without stopping the implementation? And this conference civil society is a very hard sentence to say, because usually we're the ones saying, hey, you forgot that. Hey, what about this? Hey, minorities and so on. But there is an important agenda between use and abuse here and this balance. And I'll close saying what I learned so far on net neutrality debate, which was 10 years ago that we had in Brazil. So it's very hard to disagree with net neutrality if you understand the internet infrastructures. We want good internet for all. But then when you have a country where 40% is connected, you have to make a choice. Do you want internet now for all, but not that good for few? Or do you want to wait longer and have good internet? And this is a very hard discussion, because in 2021, 30% of Brazil is disconnected. So how can I wait? At the same time, if I have an internet that's a garden with just Facebook, is it better than it was before? So the AI ethics principles for me, it's a place where you have to discuss the use and abuse. Considering the polarization is very costly and very hard to be multi-stakeholder, and where access plays a big deficit. And we see this in the cybersecurity debate. So Brazil have been victim of several major cybersecurity events. One of the Supreme Court was stopped for 1 week of functioning, just like that. We had more leaked data than citizens in Brazil, and we are 200 million and so on. So how do we balance? So sometimes it's connected to what others are saying, but coming from the Brazil perspective and the Global South, I know it's a different agenda. I know it's the same problem, and I know we are connected and we are learning on the go.
Thank you so much, Fabro. This is exactly why we wanted you to be part of this conversation, because I think it's a really important perspective that gets really lost in the broader conversation sometimes. And you're so right to point out how different the interests and equities on the ground can be. So really, really appreciate you adding that layer to this conversation. We are really short on time here, but I think that we've had a really rich conversation as it is. So unfortunately, we won't be able to turn to any of the pre-submitted questions. If anyone has any burning reactions or comments that they want to make in 30 seconds, please feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I think we're probably best to wrap this up. So thank you so much again to Jess, John, Philippe, Fabro, and Francesca. We hope to do this again, perhaps next year, to revisit the state of AI ethics and technology ethics more generally. And of course, we'll stay in touch and share your work and your materials through the lab. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. You can follow us on Twitter at TechEthicsLab, or check out our brand new website at techethics.nd.edu. And we'll be sharing this video as well. So thanks again, and everyone have a pleasant day.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for organizing this and for leading the Notre Dame IBM Tech Ethics Lab. I think it's promising, very promising for not just a conversation like this one, but also practical, concrete actions to advance the state of AI ethics. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Bye.